Welcome ladies and gentlemen to the 45th installment of my YGO Duel Links Best Deck series. Today I'm going to be showing you probably the hardest deck to master in Duel Links, Spellbooks. So I'm not sure how difficult it'll be for me to try and explain exactly how this deck works. I'm going to try my best, but if it does turn out pretty bad, you don't really understand, just watch the gameplay at the end. It basically just shows how the deck functions and how it rolls. If you don't understand, feel free to ask questions in the comments. I'll try my best to answer it. And if you like the video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and let's get into the video. Alright, so here's the deck list. There's tons of different variations of how this deck is built. This is the one that I prefer after playing several of them. I think the 30 card variant with Grasses Greener is a lot stronger than the 20 card variant, so that's why I run it. But because you are running a 30 card deck, it does come with the biggest weakness of the deck, which is kind of the only reason why it's not fully tier 1, is because Grasses Greener. The 30 card deck means that a lot of the time you'll brick. Literally 90% of your losses are due to bricks, but because it doesn't brick that often, it does win way more than it loses, keeping it easily tier 2, if not low tier 1. As for replacements for the deck, Treacherous Trap Hole isn't really needed. You can put in any other of the different spellbook cards. Preferably put in only spellbook cards that are shown already. I don't think any of the other ones are really particularly strong. Of the SR cards though, there's not really that many that you can replace. You can replace the Spellbook of Life, it's not really necessary. If you have only one of them, you can always just search for that one copy, so you don't really need two of them. So you can replace that with any of the other Spellbook cards, but as for the other ones, they are kind of necessary, so yeah. Alright, now let's go into the actual strategy of the deck and try to explain how it really functions. So the main point of the deck is you're going to be searching for a bunch of spellbooks, adding all those spellbooks to your graveyard, and then summoning a bunch of powerful monsters. That's mainly how the deck works. So to aid with this kind of graveyard interaction, what this deck runs is That Grass Looks Greener. This deck makes your deck equal to the same amount of cards as your opponent's deck, and any cards above that it will just send to the graveyard. So if your opponent has 20 cards, your deck will have 20 cards, and any excess will get sent to the graveyard. So normally in most duels, because most people run consistent decks, they run 20 cards, your 30 card deck will send 10 cards to the graveyard. This is also why the deck runs Restart. Restart is basically just used to get That Grass Looks Greener in your starting hand. If you don't have That Grass Looks Greener, you will restart. I'm just going to mention it now, if you don't have That Grass Looks Greener in your starting hand, the game's not particularly over, it's just a lot harder to win. So why do you want those 10 cards in your graveyard? First reason is Prophecy Destroyer. What Prophecy Destroyer does is it allows you to remove 3 spellbook cards from your graveyard, banish them, and then special summon it to the board. This can be really powerful as it kind of gives it an undying effect every time it is destroyed and sent to the graveyard. As long as you have 3 spellbooks in there, you can just banish them and bring it back. The second reason for this graveyard interaction is the Fall of Prophecy. What this card does is once per turn, it allows you to send 1 spellbook from your deck to the graveyard. Normally the spellbook you will choose is a spellbook that you don't already have in your graveyard. Now there's a very specific reason for this. This is because during the turn you activate this effect, during the end phase, you can then activate the second effect of Fall of Prophecy, which is you can special summon 1 Dark Spellcaster monster level 5 or higher from your deck to the board. But you can only activate this effect if you have 5 spellbook spell cards in your graveyard, all with different names. And the card you're going to be targeting with Fall of Prophecy is Reaper of Prophecy. What this card does is, depending on the amount of spellbook type spells you've got in your graveyard with different names, it will be able to activate 3 effects. 3 or more spellbooks, it gains 600 attack. 4 or more, you draw a spellbook card. 5 or more, it allows you to then special summon another spellcaster level 5 or higher monster to the board. So if you're able to get off this full combo of Fall of Prophecy into Reaper of Prophecy, you'll then have a Reaper of Prophecy with 2600 attack, an extra spellbook in your hand, which could be a removal spell, and a Prophecy Destroyer on the board, as he'll be the monster you target. Alright, so that is basically how the win con of the deck works. Now comes the rest of the spellbooks. So the rest of the spellbooks basically aim at trying to aid this combo. The main combo with the spellbooks will be Spellbook Magician into Spellbook of Secrets into Spellbook of the Master. Spellbook Magician allows you to search for 1 spellbook card. 99% of the time you'll be searching for Spellbook of Secrets, as what Spellbook of Secrets does is it allows you to search for 1 spellbook card. This does include Spellbook Magician, so these two can target each other, so if you have either of them in your hand, you can use it in any order to get either one out. The next card you'll be searching for with Spellbook of Secrets effect will be Spellbook of the Master. What this card allows you to do is then target one spellbook card in your graveyard and mimic its effect. So 99% of the time, you will be targeting Spellbook of Secrets with this card, as then it will just allow you to search for another card. So why would you do this? Well, simply because you want as many cards in the graveyard as possible, right? So if you use Spellbook of Secrets to search for Spellbook of the Master as opposed to just using Secrets to search for any other card, you can then just put a free Spellbook of Secrets in the graveyard, so it's another free card in the graveyard. So now that you've used Spellbook of the Master to copy Spellbook of Secrets, you can then target any other Spellbook card in your deck. Keep in mind, all three of the Spellbook cards I've just mentioned can only be used once per turn, so you can't just infinitely search for the same Spellbook cards over and over. So the main card you're going to be searching for is Spellbook of Fate. This card is basically the reason this deck is so strong. This card contains non-targeted banish removal. So how Spellbook of Fate works is pretty simple. Just like your other cards in the deck, it relies on the amount of spellbooks you have in your graveyard, but different to the other cards in the deck, it will require you to banish them before you can activate its effect. So if you have one spellbook in your graveyard, you can banish that, target one spell or trap card your opponent controls, return it to their hand. If it has two spellbooks in your graveyard, you can then target one monster your opponent controls, change it to face down defense position, or change it to face up attack position. And the very last effect is its removal source. If you banish 3 spellbook cards from your graveyard, you can then banish one card your opponent controls. So this is the strongest removal in the game. If you play against a hazy deck, for example, its card text reads cannot be targeted. This card technically doesn't target, so it gets around that. If you play against a Cyber Angel deck, which controls spells and stuff that stop them being destroyed, it gets around that because it banishes them. If you play against decks that like to res stuff from the graveyard, it gets around that because you banish them so they don't go to the graveyard. Another reason this deck is so strong is because of this card, is also because it counters Sylvans. Because Sylvans, they rely heavily on their first monster to get their deck running. This card allows you to simply banish it. This includes banishing Kumostream so it can't flip to activate its effect, or banishing Rose Lover so it doesn't go to the graveyard so it can't special summon a monster to the board. Alright, now we've got that out of the way, let's talk about the other spellbook cards. The other ones aren't really as relevant. For example, Spellbook of Power, you're not going to use that often other than for the fact you want a different spellbook card in your graveyard with a different name. What Spellbook of Power does is it gives one of your monsters 1000 plus attack, and when that monster kills another monster, you can add a spellbook card to your hand. So its effect is kind of not really that good, but it is just another spellbook card you can use from your hand to put in the graveyard to have another spellbook in there. And most of the time you can use this card whenever, as opposed to a lot of the other spellbooks which require you to have a spellcaster type monster on the board or a spellbook card in your hand to reveal. The next card I'll talk about is Spellbook of Eternity. This card allows you to target one of your banished spellbook cards and add it to your hand. So a lot of the time you're going to be using this just like Spellbook of the Master to target Spellbook of Secrets, because if you have that banished, you can then activate this card to bring Spellbook of Secrets back, to then get another card, which will then put 2 spellbook cards in your graveyard. But a lot of the time you can also use it just to get your Spellbook of Fate back, or a Spellbook of Life, basically just any spellbook you like for the situation you're in, but most of the time you're just going to be getting a Spellbook of Secrets, because this allows you to then keep the ball rolling and put more spellbook cards in your graveyard. The next card I'm going to talk about is Spellbook of Life. So this card has very specific conditions to activating it, and what it will do when it's activated is it will get a spellcaster monster out of your graveyard onto the board. So you'll only use this card very rarely because it has very specific summoning conditions. The conditions are you have to have a spellbook in your hand, you have to have a spellcaster on the board, and you have to have a spellcaster in your graveyard to banish. So you can search for this card again because it's a spellbook, so if you have these specific conditions available to you, and obviously a spellcaster in your graveyard you want to special summon, such as Reaper of Prophecy, you can then search for Spellbook of Life and use it. Now the very last spellbook I've kind of kept separate in the graphic, as you can see, because its effect isn't really... It's kind of the worst spellbook you have in that once you've used its effect, it then makes itself useless, so the second copy becomes useless. And if it's not used at the start of the game, most of the time it will also be useless, because it requires you to have no spellbooks in your graveyard, which most of the time will not happen. But it can help if you don't start off with that grass is greener in your hand, or if you don't have a Spellbook of Secrets in your hand, because what it will do is it just allows you to get an extra spellbook into your hand at the start of the game. So what this card does is it shows your opponent 3 spellbook cards from your deck that you have selected, all with different names. He chooses one of them, and you add that to your hand. As for what cards you want to choose, most of the time it's kind of situational, but most of the time you're just going to try and choose Spellbook of Secrets, Spellbook of Fate, or Spellbook of the Master, depending on what cards you already have in your hand. So there are 2 reasons this card is run. The first, it has a different name, so if it's targeted by Fall of the Prophecy to send to the graveyard, it will then have a different name. Plus, it won't make your deck worse when you do it. All it will do is thin out your deck, get rid of a card that can no longer be used. And the secondary reason is because it works fairly similar to how Spellbook of Secrets works, in that it allows you to add a spellbook card to your hand at the cost of itself, meaning you'll have an extra spellbook card in your graveyard and an extra spellbook in your hand. So there's 2 tips I'm going to give as extra about the deck. The first, make sure you check the card text before you use something. For example, Spellbook of the Master does require you to have a spellbook type monster on the board, and requires you to have a spellbook in your hand as well as itself. So just like that, there's a few other cards in the deck that contain this effect, so make sure you read the card text before you use it. Otherwise you're going to be searching for cards that cannot actually be activated. And the last tip I'm going to give is with Treacherous Trap Hole. So what Treacherous Trap Hole does is it allows you to target 2 monsters on the board and destroy them. But this means you do have to have 2 monsters on the board to destroy. So if your opponent only has 1 monster on the board, if you have Prophecy Destroyer on the board as well, you can activate its effect, destroy your own Prophecy Destroyer, destroy their monster, but since Prophecy Destroyer has the effect that it can be revived, it doesn't really matter. You activate its effect, you bring it back. So just keep in mind that if you have Treacherous Trap Hole on the board, and your opponent only controls 1 monster, you can destroy your own destroyer. It's kind of a weird tip, but I have done it quite a few times, as you'll see in the gameplay. I'm pretty sure I've done it twice in just the gameplays I'm going to show you. Alright guys, that's pretty much it for the talking part of this video. If you didn't get anything, please feel free to leave a comment. I will respond to any questions I get. It can be pretty hard to get your head around how this deck actually works. There will be 4 to 5 gameplays at the end of the video which will show this deck in action, so it's not that hard for you to try and work out how it works, but it can be hard to try to master it. It is a fun deck, so don't be scared to play it just because of its difficulty level. If you do get time to play it, do play it. It is a lot of fun. But anyway guys, if you liked the video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe. I do a new video guide every week. If you feel even more generous, head over to YouTube Gaming and sponsor the channel. The more sponsors I get, obviously the more content I'll put out. And like I said earlier, if there's something you don't get about the deck, please feel free to ask a question. I do respond to every question I get. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.